Hello and welcome everyone who are joining today's meeting either in person or over Zoom. The title of today's meeting is From Egypt to Sudan, Revolution in the 21st Century. We will be discussing, as announced in the meeting invitation, what a revolution looks like. And, in the past decades, we have seen revolutionary uprisings across the world, and the most, famously known or prominent ones of them actually took place during the Arab Spring in 2011. The revolts have had different outcomes, which we today discuss. And in some cases, like Sudan, the revolution is still an ongoing and a complicated process. Even in 2019, we have seen a renewed way of revolutionary struggle in the world, from Puerto Rico, Chile to Lebanon, and after COVID in Sri Lanka. And we know there are differences and similarities between different revolutionary uprisings. So today we are going to also discuss what we can learn from those experiences for a revolutionary current in Canada. Thanks everybody for coming today. Let me explain the format of the meeting. The speaker will be giving a presentation which will last up to 30 minutes, half an hour, and then I will open the floor for discussion. And after the discussion is over, which will take for about 45 minutes, I will give the speaker the opportunity to wrap up and respond to the questions. And if you want to talk, please raise your hand by clicking on the raise button, or I will be probably seeing those who would like to talk in the room on the camera. And also, before we begin, I want to do the land acknowledgement. As settlers, we acknowledge our occupation of lands that are the indigenous territories of Turtle Island. Furthermore, we support all struggles for indigenous sovereignty in whatever forms they take by the hundreds of First Nations and Inuit communities that have resided here for many thousands of years, and the Métis communities that have developed in the last hundreds of years. We don't just do a land acknowledgement unless it is accompanied by action in support for indigenous land defenders. So we will then post a link to the 1492 Land Back Lane support group in the chat window. Please go to that window and sign up to support this important fight. And now I'm going to introduce our speaker today. Our speaker is Hossam el-Hamalawy. He's an Egyptian journalist, a blogger, a photographer, and a socialist activist. He's a member of the Revolutionary Socialists in Egypt and was an organizer during the Egyptian Revolution in 2011, which overthrew the dictator Hosni Mubarak after, days of occupation of Tahrir Square and hundreds of strikes. As I said, he has time up to half an hour, and it's over to you, Hossam. Thanks for being with us here today.
Thanks a lot, comrade. I'm really humbled actually to be among you, and it really feels awkward to me that I should be talking to you about the Egyptian revolution while you have my dear comrade Ibrahim al-Sahari among your ranks, whom I truly consider to be one of the heroes actually of the uprising. So I will try to be as brief as possible so as to leave more room maybe for other contributions, including ones by Ibrahim, I hope. And let me start by this. You are in Canada, which is one of the most advanced industrial nations in the West. It might not be a superpower as the US, but it is still a superpower. And I am sure that you, as revolutionary socialists in such an advanced, mature capitalist society, that you always feel that you are on the margin and that you are going against the common sense, and that you are talking or reading about a revolution which sounds much more like a fantasy or something that might only happen in the global south, where oppression is perceived to be much more, and I mean, it is on so many levels, than in the West or in the global north, where there is also some level of romanticization about people's struggles there and their militancy and how much they are not bought into the system, unlike their counterparts in the West. But from my own personal experience, and my comrade Ibrahim, might add later, believe me, the situation has not been that radically different for us as socialists in Egypt when we were starting out to organize in the 1990s. At that time, the Soviet Union had collapsed. Egyptian left was largely Stalinized across its history. So it collapsed also with the Soviet Union, and already it has been going through a steady phase of decline following the failure of the 1977 bread uprising, where there was a mini uprising for 2 days that happened in Egypt at that time. So when we were organizing on the campuses following the collapse of the left, and we were trying to restart the activities and rebuild the leftist cells on the university campuses, people treated us like aliens from Mars or from some other galaxy. It's crazy to talk about socialism. I mean, it has already been tried under Nasser in Egypt, the Soviet Union had collapsed, Eastern Europe has collapsed. This was the height of the whole talk about the clash of civilizations, the end of history, Fukuyama and Samuel Huntington, and all of these ideas that were put forward at the time that brought to us the fantastic news that capitalism has triumphed. But not only that, comrades, people would talk to us and tell us, when was the last time the Egyptians ever revolted? And actually, when you think about it, the last time we had a revolution in Egypt was in 1919. It's not like, when people now talk about the Egyptian revolution, you get the impression that, the Egyptian people are revolutionary by nature, or that they have been going through like continuous struggles across the decades. That's not true. The last revolution we had was in 1919. There were definitely heroic social struggles all throughout our history, but it went through ups and downs in the same way that it went through ups and downs in other countries. There isn't some revolutionary nation and there isn't some reactionary nation. Things do not work in that fashion. At the time when we were student activists in the 1990s, you could not whisper Mubarak's name. You could not chant about Mubarak. You could denounce the government, the government. You can talk about the regime, but you cannot talk about Hosni Mubarak. Egypt was going through its own war on terror, which was a dirty war, Latin American style, where dissidents were extrajudicially executed, where there was an expansion in martial law, a crackdown on dissent of all shades, industrial actions plummeted. This was also the height of the neoliberal transition in Egypt when the Hosni Mubarak regime signed the so-called ERSAP, which is acronym for Economic Reforms and Structural Adjustment Program. And this was the neoliberal, basically, program under the sponsorship of the IMF and the World Bank, by which social spending started to be cut, public sector companies were put out on the stock market, whatever laws that existed in the past to protect some or to provide some level of protection for the workers in the factories were being scrapped off. So we were a minority at the time, and we were treated as aliens if we spoke about a revolution or spoke about the need for a general strike or an uprising or what have you. But the year 2000 started to mark the turning point. And this was when the Second Palestinian Intifada broke out. Comrades, the Palestinian cause has always been the biggest radicalizing factor for Egyptian youth across the decades. For example, in 1968, we also had our own 1968. It wasn't just the French May. We also had our February and November 1968 in Egypt. And it produced a movement that set a trajectory that ended with the 1977 or culminated with the 1977 uprising. And the ones who led the social mobilizations in the beginning were the leftist-led society of supporters of the Palestinian Revolution on the Egyptian university campuses. In the same way, with the outbreak of the Second Palestinian Intifada in 2000, we started getting mass protests that were the biggest thing that I saw as a student activist at the time. From previously maybe leading a protest at best of 100, we suddenly found ourselves leading protests of 15,000 students in Cairo University, for example. And all the chants at the time where they would start by, solidarity chants with the Palestinians, anti-US imperialist and anti-Zionist chants. And then as soon as the riot police shows up and they start attacking the protesters, the attention right away shifts to the domestic situation. So, I mean, again, the Palestinian cause is a regional cause, but it's like a backdoor to actually domestic dissent at the end of the day. And it's not a coincidence when you fast forward to 2011, and you will find that most of the leaders of the revolution, they came from the pro-Palestine or from the Palestine Solidarity Campaign back in 2000. I mean, it was mainly us. Now, these solidarity protests, they were like a rock in still water. So after street dissent was eliminated in the 1990s during the war on terror, now the streets were reclaimed bit by bit. So from 2000, then in 2002, we had a second cycle of protests. They were also triggered by an Israeli onslaught on the West Bank cities led by Ariel Sharon at the time. And that's when the Jenin massacre happened. And this triggered protests among the professional syndicates, like the lawyers syndicates, the journalist syndicate, and the university campuses. And for 2 days, comrades, Cairo University and its surrounding neighborhood erupted in Giza for 2 days in continuous fighting with the police forces. And people, this was the first time in my life that I heard the chant, Hosni Mubarak is just like Sharon. He's the same color, he's the same figure. I mean, the chant rhymes in Arabic, but from being a minority who would chant against Mubarak and we would be hushed by the people so as not to get in trouble, suddenly we were at the forefront of thousands strong protests chanting directly against Mubarak and against his collusion with US imperialism, with people start generalizing politically about the domestic situation right away. I swear to you, like in one of the protests that I had organized on campus at the time, that was against Israeli bombing of southern Lebanon. The protest would start by chanting against the Israeli aggression, against US imperialism, in support of the Palestinian resistance and the Lebanese resistance. But by the end of the protest, we were discussing how the government burns the sugar canes in Upper Egypt, which is the south, during the war on terror, without giving compensations to the peasants. We were discussing the education system. We were discussing gentrification. So, and this protest started as an anti-war protest, but the focus quickly shifted to the domestic situation. This is important to bear in mind because in the right-wing discourse about the Middle East, the right-wing pundits, they always tell you that Palestine is the opium of the Arab people. The Arab regimes, they use the Palestinian cause to shift the attention of their domestic populations towards the whatever problems into some outside enemy. That's not true, comrades. And whenever the regimes tried to do so, it always fired back, just like what we saw in Egypt. So the mobilizations in the Egyptian streets continued over the first 3 years after the Intifada. And we had a second mini uprising in downtown Cairo. I mean, uprising is a big word, but that's what we dubbed it at the time, because it was an evidence actually of how much the political scene has been desertified. We did not see any protests before that big. And I'm talking here about 40,000 people probably. So with the 2003 protest against the invasion of Iraq, this managed to win us a margin in the streets. And in this margin of the streets that did not exist in the 1990s, came from it the movement Kifaya, which is Arabic for enough. Kifaya continued mobilizing against Hosni Mubarak, and this was a step in the political consciousness. I mean, previously, you had to campaign over Palestine in order to be able to speak about Mubarak. Now you're having a clear, explicit anti-Mubarak movement. Kifaya mobilized over 2 years, but we never really exceeded we used to call it the middle-class ghetto. We never really exceeded, we never managed to create roots among the Egyptian working class at the time. Kifaya heroically campaigned against Mubarak, but it was mainly composed of students, intellectuals, writers, artists, lawyers, pharmacists, doctors, university professors, researchers. This was the kind of the middle-class caliber that was part of it. Then suddenly, in December 2006, that's when the Mahalla textile strike started. Mahalla is in the Nile Delta in the north of Egypt, and it is the third largest textile mill in the world. At the time, because now the numbers have gone down, it had roughly 27,000 workers. Suddenly, Mahalla went on strike, and the strike was led actually by the women workers in the factory, or it was started by the women workers on the factory, and it was over economic bonuses that they were promised earlier. And the government was trying to dodge its promises at the time. The Mahalla strike lasted for 3 days, and as soon as the strikers won, by the domino effect, this triggered the winter of labor discontent in Egypt, where literally all the textile mills in the country went on strike, demanding the same bonuses as Ghazl al-Mahalla. And then the militancy started spilling over to other sectors, like the railways, like cement workers, and then the civil servants. I used to attend public meetings where, like, angry civil servants were trying to organize. And it was a common thing to hear at the time, like, do we have to do like the textile workers to get our rights in this country? So here you can see the domino effect has started working. Why did suddenly this strike wave erupt? We have to ask ourselves. Although Kifaya did not manage to create roots among the workers, but Kifaya had a very clever media strategy, which I dub as the visualization of dissent strategy. And this is something that us as revolutionary socialists adopted on a mass scale later. And this helped us to punch always above our weight. Even when Kifaya organized 20 strong protests, a protest of only 20 people, with banners against Hosni Mubarak and cartoons against him and slogans, we used to ensure that the media would be there, that satellite TVs would be there, and that we would disseminate the visuals online to the maximum audience possible. The aim of this was simple. We wanted to send out a message to the public that this taboo of Hosni Mubarak has been broken. So if the taboo of Mubarak is broken, you can rebel against your own CEO in your company. If you get any revolutionary ideas about changing the system or rebelling or doing a strike, we wanted to let you know that you are not a crazy person and that there are other people who are thinking the same way. And actually, there are other people who have started to take action down that road. There isn't a factory that I entered in 2007 with the outbreak of the winter of labor discontent. There isn't a single factory that I've entered without hearing the following from the workers. We read that Ghazl al-Mahalla won, so we decided to strike. We heard that Ghazl al-Mahalla had won, so we decided to strike. We saw Ghazl al-Mahalla had won, so we decided to strike. Here, comrades, the spread of information is essentially an act of agitation. It's a message to the rest of the population that, you know what? It's not crazy to do strikes. Strikes can actually work. I recall that in 2009, in the run-up to the revolution, we have a proverb in Egypt, which says in Arabic, "In lik and al-kalb haja qul ya sidi," which means that if you need something from the dog, tell him you're my master. Like, be a hypocrite. In 2009, I remember, like, in this proverb spread, like, if you need something from the dog, tell him I'm staging a sit-in. Because sit-ins had become like rampant everywhere, that neoliberal commentators in some of the leading newspapers were like tearing their hair apart and saying that, we have a plague now. We have a strike plague engulfing Egypt. Within that context, that when the anti-torture movement in Egypt called for protests over the death of Khalid Said, who was a young Egyptian who was brutally murdered by the police in Alexandria. It's a tragic story, and he became later the icon of the revolt. So this anti-torture movement that was sparked by his death, it could not have happened in the year 2000. People have been dying under torture before that. And actually, some people try to theorize that, oh, it's because he's middle class and this shocked the Egyptian population because it could be you, not like, some other poor guy. But actually, middle class also guys have been dying under torture before that. But this incident happened at a moment where Egyptians felt confident enough to confront their regime after an entire decade of small struggles here and there happening that have been accumulating. These struggles were giving them confidence, giving them experience, giving them a counter-hegemonic approach towards society. So the same people who have been ridiculing us in the 1990s for talking about a revolution, because Egyptians will never revolt, I saw them with my own eyes during the Friday of Rage, which was the 28th of January, 2011, when tens of thousands of Egyptians marched on Tahrir Square and in the other urban centers, confronting the police heroically, who killed hundreds on that day. And I recall, I took part in the marches on that day, and I saw at least two people whom I used to distribute our underground newsletter to back in the 1990s. And they used to ridicule me that, Hossam, we support you. I'll buy your newspaper or newsletter, but, this is not going to happen. And here they were, shoulder to shoulder with me, marching to take it down. So I don't want to take up much longer time, comrades, so as to leave more time for discussion. But I just want to stress maybe just two quick points. One is that although the focus of the international media and the activist community around the world, for very understandable reasons, on Tahrir Square, it wasn't Tahrir Square that brought down Hosni Mubarak, and it wasn't the army that brought down Hosni Mubarak. We occupied Tahrir from the 28th of January all the way till the 11th of February. And I recall that after the second week so it was overall like 18 days, roughly. And I recall that in the second week, after we confronted, the thugs that they sent us, trying to terrorize us, after confronting the police, and after confronting the army's attempts to encroach and to disperse actually the sit-in on a couple of occasions, people started running out of ideas. And in the midst of this, the prime minister decided to reopen the businesses and reopen the banks and the corporations, and to try to get Egypt back to work so as to normalize the country, while us, the lunatics in Tahrir, would be isolated. But this fired back, because people took Tahrir to the workplaces. And that's what forced the army to step in and to depose Hosni Mubarak, because the mass strikes that erupted in the last week of the uprising, this was the silver bullet that brought Hosni Mubarak down. The second thing that I will conclude with is that obviously 10 years later, when we look back, when we look now at Egypt, the situation is definitely much worse than it was before 2011. But that's what counter-revolutions do. Counter-revolutions do not restore the old order, comrades, because the old order has failed. When you get a revolution, this means that the order has failed. So you have to come up and you have to build a new order to try to, avoid the mistakes of the past, which has led those mobs get the confidence to rebel against us, the ruling elites. That's how they think. So from 2013 up until today, Egypt has been witnessing its most violent epoch in its history in terms of lethal violence and carceral violence. And the kind of system that evolved out of this military coup to crush the revolution is something that we have not seen in our modern history. People sometimes love to draw parallels with Nasser, but it's not true. Even under Nasser, it wasn't that bad. The problem with that regime is that it rules without civil society, without a buffer between it and society. There is no meaningful parliament. There are no meaningful institutions. All NGOs have been crushed. There isn't any meaningful political parties any longer. It's the security services micromanaging the population on a daily basis. That's the new repressive regime that we have in Egypt under Abdel Fattah al-Sisi. How can you help while you are in Canada? Canada sells arms to Egypt. Canada cooperates security-wise with Egypt. Canada is a partner, an economic partner with the regime in Egypt. Hence, Canada is a partner in crime. Any sort of pressure that you can put on your own government in order to cut relations with the Sisi regime or to stop selling arms to Sisi and the other autocrats that we have in the region, it's a plus for us. And the other thing is that any sort of pressure that you can do in front of the Egyptian embassies, whenever there are detainees, whenever there are protests or ongoing strikes, that really helps, comrades, even if the numbers are small. Just make sure that the visuals get disseminated to the widest audience possible. The last thing is that whether it's Berlin or in Canada or it is in Cairo or elsewhere, capitalism is a matrix. It's a interconnected system. This means that if we hit the system in any of its joints, that helps the resistance in other parts. So even if you get active locally over a very localized issue in your own state, in your own city, in your own village, that helps us in Egypt. If you campaign over garbage collection in your own neighborhood, that helps us in Egypt. Any sort of strike that you do that weakens this system anywhere, that helps us in Egypt. So I hope that all of you to always remain hopeful and to always believe that the revolution is such a concrete project. It's not some abstract idea that you will just discuss in a study group and go home, because it will never happen in Canada. No, it can. We are entering very rough times, times where, we're already emerging from the COVID crisis. We are facing the specter of another global conflict triggered by the war in Ukraine. Things are not going to go good, comrades, for the global economy, including the advanced industrial Western countries in the near future. This is becoming very near. And at that time, and when the hegemony of the state starts to break down, people will start looking for alternatives. So if the IS in Canada, it cannot provide an alternative, they will start looking for the Nazis. They will start looking for the far right. So, again, I want to conclude by thanking you for giving me a platform to speak tonight. And I hope that this would be the start of actually a long relationship where we can coordinate and share information about our own experiences and about our own struggles. And I'm more than happy to take any questions from you, comrades. Thank you.